As I said, I wanted to recognize this day as the nation does each and every year, and I'd like to do that too, even though it's a week early. We're still doing the same thing. First, to do that, we'll start with something that CareNet has distributed to us as some information about what they do as a crisis pregnancy center here in Schuylkill County, and ties in with exactly what we're going to be talking about. So this morning we'll begin with kind of focusing in on what CareNet does here, but talking about the most vulnerable of life, and that is in the mother's womb, and I'll use scripture to talk about that, but also just kind of expand that out a little bit to say this is why it's so important, and this is why, the reason it's so important is because it has so many implications in the rest of our life, understanding the value of human life. And of course, CareNet is trying to communicate that at the very beginning part of life. And that's why we support them, that's why we give to them, that's why we help and serve them and partner with them in lots of different ways, because they are championing this, the value of a human life even inside of a mother's womb. So we'll kind of start there, and then we'll expand that out a little bit. So Steve, if you want to play that clip for CareNet.
Seems like all I could see was the struggle.
So our first visit, we were nervous because we weren't really sure what we were getting into, but we came here and it was really comfortable, and they had us, answering questions and just kind of getting to know us so that they could prepare us for what we were going to do next.
It was really kind of emotional, and I was kind of nervous because I didn't know what to expect, and I just moved to this area.
I actually did cry whenever we did the praying part. It was really nice meeting Cheryl and sitting down and being completely open and honest.
It was very comfortable. It was very outgoing, and very informative.
It's given me a lot of confidence in what to expect and what to do before she gets here.
Well, just the education you get here really prepares you in ways like if you were just doing this on your own with some help from your family, they might not know everything. Like I've learned so much coming here, so much.
So I was so prepared from watching the videos, asking questions, talking about it. And then when she was in the incubator, I prayed so hard. Back in Hancock, there's none of that, and I probably would have never prayed.
It's almost like, in the beginning, you're going through a lot of struggles and you're not sure if you can do it all. And then you come here and they're really helpful and everybody's really nice. And the more you hear and the more you learn, you realize, you feel like you can do it.
I felt like I was at a place where I could open up and let go, which really made me look forward to coming once a week. With everything that I had going on in my life, it was like somewhere that I could go to really get my mind off of everything that was going on and focus on what I needed to focus on. When I came to CareNet, I didn't have a very close relationship with God. And I had struggles with my depression and my anxiety and all the hardships I've ever had in life. Going through this pregnancy and putting my faith in God during it has made all of the struggles that I have just with my pregnancy and the stress that much easier. It's taken so much weight off of my shoulder, and faith gives me that strength.
When we first started out this pregnancy, we found out some bad news. As we kept coming here and we kept praying and we kept hoping, I feel like God just kind of took over and made things so much easier. And now, it turns out we're having a healthy baby.
It definitely helped to be able to come here, especially with my dad. That helped a lot. Because I haven't spoken to my dad in 3 years. And when I came here, that faith helped me get that little bit of push and forgive.
I think of a safe place.
Helpful, educational.
I would say definitely encouragement.
The care part is really important.
Friendship.
Like, they actually care about how you're doing, and they actually care about your pregnancy.
All the prayers, the devotionals, and it has really turned my life around. I have a better relationship with my boyfriend. We're more prepared for when this baby's gonna come. I feel more confident in life than I ever have. Nothing's gonna hold me back. And I really owe that to putting my faith in God.
They were showing you some images of where their offices are located now. Hopefully you've recognized some of that. They still have an office in Pottsville, but most of the clients, those are clients that they are currently seeing or have seen, go to Real Options, which is over at Comprehensive Women's Health Center, where in that building they're downstairs, but do have access to ultrasound machines and things like that at that particular building. And so you can hear what those girls were saying about what CareNet means in their lives, and CareNet's objective is trying to help prepare them, to help them see this baby that's growing as a life before it's even born, and get them ready to be able to parent, to mother that life. And in the midst of all that, CareNet is also a Christian organization. So you heard them saying about praying and stuff like that. They do that with their clients. They share with them, talk with them. There's, of course, certain things you can say and cannot say, but behind all of that is their devotion to trying to see people come to faith in Jesus. So their ministry is really doing what Psalm 139 is talking about and kind of highlighting in terms of how we as Christians view life. And Psalm 139 is really David talking about the Lord and how everywhere he goes, God is. He can't escape God. He can't go to the farthest points of the earth to get away from him. No matter where David is, God is there. God is so intimately involved in our life that he says this in Psalm 139, verse 13. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. So David, kind of drawing on this idea that God is there. He was kind of talking about God's omniscience, that he knows everything, God's omnipresence, that God can be everywhere all at once at the same time. And so much so that God was there even when he was being put together in his mother's womb. So, of course, the idea there is talking about life, where it begins, birth and creation of life. And what I want to draw out this morning is tell you that you've been stamped. Did you know that? You've been stamped. You've been stamped by God. Some of you have been stamped in different ways. Maybe you've received hand stamps before. Anybody ever go to Knoebels? Or Nobles, whichever way you want to say it, it's the same place. And they stamp your hand. I've been to other places, same thing. They're stamping you get a stamp to recognize that you're a part of whatever is happening. And then you have certain privileges If you don't have that stamp on your hand, there are certain things you cannot do. If you're trying to get access, trying to get in, they got to see the stamp. The stamp's not there. You can't get that. That stamp is marking something about you for that particular time and that place. It's giving you certain privileges and rights because you have that stamp. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that you all have been stamped by God. You are made in His image, and therefore God has stamped you and has given you certain rights and privileges. And that stamp starts way back when you're being formed in your mother's womb. That is why, as Grace Church, we support organizations like CareNet, because that's what they believe about life. And we want to champion the value of life, even life that is so vulnerable it cannot speak for itself. We want to say we value it even at the very beginning, at the first moments. And so the psalmist is kind of drawing that out, recognizing that all of us have been stamped by God. And because you were stamped by God, you have certain rights and privileges. And I want to expand on that a little bit as I go on of what that means, those certain rights and privileges that you have. But first I want to just look at Psalm 139 and recognize what David is saying here about God and about life. Psalm 139 is basically the entirety of the psalm, is basically God's intimate involvement in our lives. Specifically, what I read for you in verse 13 through 18, specifically when we are created, when we were created, when we were formed and shaped. So God is intimately involved in our lives. David is saying in Psalm 139, so intimate is that involvement that it happens when we are even formed and shaped by Him. And we hear that being said in the language that David is using here in this particular psalm as he talks about being made or being created or being formed. And we're set apart, and we're fearfully and wonderfully made. And he says in verse 13, "You are created for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." Or your acts. God's acts are wonderful, some have translated, or extraordinary. They're wonderful, or it can be translated extraordinary. In the language that David is using here, this was a poem, this was a poetry, a song, not part of the law code. It wasn't law that, from the book of Moses we would have seen. It was part of the something that they would have sang, or a poem of some kind. So we see David kind of trying to emphasize and trying to show to us that God is intimately involved in the very beginnings of life, and life itself. And the language being used there is often used of when God was birthing or forming a nation. This same kind of verbiage is used when Israel is being birthed, is when Israel is being brought about, these people known as the Jews, and God forms them into His people, to His chosen people, and He births a nation we call Israel. That same language is being used, except David, and if you were a Jew, you would have heard that. You would have heard that language. You would have known those stories of the acts or the works of God and bringing about this nation, about the Exodus. Most of them not there. They would not have been there. But David is trying to get us to think about those things in regard to the making of a human being. The same idea of how God birthed this nation is the same idea of how God is involved and creates human life. And we hear that language again in some of the other words being used, that God is kind of pictured here as putting us together. And the words being used in my inmost being, my insides, the inside of me, it's like all of my organs and my heart and all that kind of stuff. God is putting all that together. He's knit or woven. It kind of has that idea, if you knit or you do anything like that, you're making this afghan or whatever it is you use, and you're putting it together and it creates this blanket or whatever. David is saying that's what God does. He is knitting us together. He is weaving us together. He is involved in that process. And he uses the language of my frame and my unformed body. He says in verse 15, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. My frame, he was literally bones. My bones were not what makes us our skeleton. That the idea is God is involved in putting us together. Physically speaking, that this all happens inside, and of course now we can kind of see some of that happening. We call it an ultrasound, but certainly in David's day, it's in that secret place. Nobody sees this. Nobody knows what's going on. It's just life is being created, and the language, of course, is that God is a part of that. And of course now with ultrasounds and all the technology and how medicine has advanced, we can figure all that out. We can see that. We know why this is happening when and this is happening there. As David's writing this, though, it's this place that is a secret place that God is a part of, and it just happens. God puts the arms where the arms are supposed to go, the eyes where the eyes are supposed to go, and he is forming us inside of that womb. It's a special thing that is taking place. Just as God said, you are my special people, Israel. I am creating a nation out of you. God is communicating, David is saying, that same thing is happening every single time a life is born. Because you've been stamped by him. You have his image. You are image bearers of him. That is why it was so important for the Jews to follow God's laws, to live the way God said, because they were image bearers of their Creator. And so the whole world was going to find out about this God through these people called the Jews. And it's a special thing to be image bearers of God. And all of that begins, all of that happens in this secret place, in this place where none of us can see, or they couldn't in David's day, inside the mother's womb. And God is forming and shaping and putting together. And that's not even to mention the way that God wires us. This is specifically talking about some physical features that we have, and God is kind of putting all that together, crafting it together. But what about all of the ways in which you and I are wired differently, our personalities and how different they are, our likes and dislikes, the things that we struggle with and those that we don't struggle with, all of those kinds of things. Where did all them come from? Where did they begin? When did God start doing that? We, as Christians, believe it's at the beginning of life. This is where it all starts, and God is intimately involved in it. And so we've got to be very careful on how we're treating that life and understand and know that it is life that is in there. So as I said, I wanted to share about how God views life, how CareNet begins with life. CareNet begins with that womb, at the birth of this child, at the conception of this child, and God is forming and shaping this child. And why should we value that life like we do? And I think it's because there are larger implications on how we understand the value of life. And there's something that all of us should know that probably you've learned. There's a lot of text there. Hopefully you can see it okay. It should sound very familiar to you. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. You know what that is? Yes. Declaration of Independence. Understanding, if the founders of our country would not have understood what the Hebrew text was saying here, that would have never been written. There is this understanding about life that is there. that we get and conceptualize through the Hebrew Scriptures. That's why we understand life the way we do. This would have never been able to be written without what God said in the Scriptures, in the Bible, without this kind of understanding. It's an understanding that your life, the fact that you are an image bearer of God, gives you certain rights and privileges. You are stamped as one of God's loved creations, and therefore you have certain rights and privileges. And so there is no government that can give you rights and privileges. Your worth, your value as a person is not defined by a government. It is not defined by your education. It is not defined by what class you come from. It is not defined by your ethnic background. It is not defined by the wealth that you have or whether you're famous or not famous. Your worth is defined by God, and it starts right here. And so the implications are, the more that we value and see life as worthy of protecting and saving, the more we're going to understand this. This is a very Western idea, Western way of thinking, and it is all deriving from the Hebrew Scriptures. This would have never been written in places in the East, and there's still people that don't believe this. There's religions out there that don't believe this. If you're in a caste system in Hindu culture, and you are the lowest caste, your worth is defined by the fact that you're part of that caste. And there are people called untouchables because they are not worth anything. That's the viewpoint. But they are worth something. And so you have missionaries going into these places that no one will go, and probably one of the most well-known is Mother Teresa in Calcutta, and that's who she was ministering to. These people that were untouchables, they were not viewed as created and loved by God, and so they were cast aside. And because of our Christian belief system, people go into these places and say, no, that's not how it works. You are dearly loved because you have been stamped by your Creator, and your worth is defined by Him. And if we lose sight of that, we're going to start losing sight of how we treat our fellow human beings. And we already see that. You know that. The way that our culture has moved so far away from the fact of you and I can disagree and still be friends. And the language that's being used out there is no longer civil to one another. The language being used out there is degrading in a lot of ways, and we're losing sight of the fact that every human being, whether you agree with them or not, has been stamped by God and therefore is worthy and valuable. And I think this teaches us something about who God is. God created humanity. God created human beings. God is doing this, putting us together in the womb, and therefore you have intrinsic worth and value. There are certain unalienable rights that you have. The government doesn't give them to you. Society doesn't give them to you. Your worth and utility in society doesn't give it to you. You're viewed as worthy when you can work and produce and be a part of the society and the economy, and when all that's gone, your worth goes down. That is what some people believe. That is the ideas behind naturalistic thinking. If you are somebody who believes in naturalism, your worth is directly connected to your utility, your output. And therefore, the strong and the fittest will survive. And that's exactly what Adolf Hitler believed. That was teaching from Friedrich Nietzsche. And because of that, we saw what happened. That kind of ideology, looking at people in that way, creates monsters. God said, you all have intrinsic worth because you were all stamped with my image. So even those people you don't get along with, even those people you don't necessarily like, we need to treat them a certain way because they have been stamped. Maybe they're trying to rub their stamp off. Maybe they don't know that it's there. Maybe they don't care about it. But you and I know that they have been, and therefore we should treat them a particular way. And all of that begins when they're being formed. God stamps you at that point. And because of that stamp, you have intrinsic worth and value. You reflect God's image. When you walk around with that stamp at Knoebels or whatever, you're allowed to do certain things. You have certain rights and privileges. You are a part of that group for that particular time because you've got that stamp. You and I, just as the Jews were reflecting God's image, and God said, this is why it's so important, because you're reflecting my image to the world, you and I are doing that same thing. We reflect God's image. We are image bearers. So that person that could care less about God, who is an atheist, and they're really nice, and they do a lot of good things, and you're thinking, wow, I mean, that person has no faith in their life, but they're really kind, and they're really nice. All they're doing is reflecting the image of the one who created them. Whether they recognize their creator or not, because you and I are stamped with his image, we act like God in certain ways and at certain times. Even when we don't believe in him, we have the ability to be kind. We have the ability to do good. We have the ability to want to see justice happen, to believe in truth, because we are image bearers. We are reflecting God and who he is to the world around us. And that's what you and I do with our lives. Your worth comes from him, and you reflect it out. And that is why human creation, the only part of his creation that says God breathed life into them. You are special because you are a human being. And therefore, every human being is special, regardless of what they can do for society, regardless of their fame or wealth or utility or any of that. This is a very Christian idea. Without the Hebrew Scriptures, we would not live in the world that you and I are living in today, in Western thinking in the Western part of the world. We would have never been able to eradicate slavery in this country. We would have never been able to eradicate some of the injustices that were being done to people in this country if we didn't understand the value and intrinsic worth of human life. All of that is coming from the Hebrew Scriptures. And of course, God putting on flesh recognizes the special value of human beings. God became a human. It is a special thing to be human. And your worth is from him. Nobody can tell you you are worthless because God says you have intrinsic value. The value of human life is established on the basis of God. That's why our Declaration of Independence reads the way that it reads. It is not given to you by a government. And of course, it is not a king who can say, you're valuable, you're not, you are. It cannot be taken away, and it cannot be given to you by some person, because it is established and rooted in God himself. And if we start losing our sight with how this works, we're going to be living in a place that we don't really want to live in. And that is why we champion even the most vulnerable of life and say it is valuable and it is worth something. I know they can't say it, but God is doing something special here right inside of this womb. And because God is doing it and stamping it, it automatically has worth and value. So we champion the cause for the most vulnerable in our society. And we try and reach out to them. This is why Jesus has called us to reach those who are lost. And he goes to the needy and the blind and the deaf and the lame because they were cast aside in society. They were nobodies. They were nothing. And that's who Jesus goes to. And he tells them, you've been stamped. You are stamped with God's image. You are worth something. You are valuable. Get up and walk. Open your eyes and see. And now God has called us to do that same thing. So we partner with people like CareNet. We go and try and reach the disadvantaged and the poor and the broken and the hurting in society because we want them to know they are valuable and worth something. And so are you. You've been stamped with God's image. And therefore, God deeply and dearly loves you because he made you, he put you together, and now you bear his image. Let's pray. God, thank you for seeing us as valuable and worthy, and that our intrinsic worth comes and derives solely and directly from you. God, may we see that in our own lives, and may we be the people who are championing that in our society. Whether it's reaching out to those who are broken and lost, reaching out to those who society has forgotten about and the most vulnerable in society, or championing the cause of life itself in a mother's womb. Lord, I pray that you would help us to do that. Our faith demands that we share that. Our faith demands that we live and believe that. And I don't want to live in a place that doesn't recognize this. We've seen places like that throughout history, and they still exist today. And it's all coming from the fact that people don't know that they have been stamped. And people try and eradicate that stamp. Governments try and do that. Lord, I thank you for this country and its recognition that we have certain inalienable rights that come only from you, that we have worth and value because we're created in your image, that all people were created equal. Lord, I pray that you would help us to partner with CareNet, that you would bless that ministry as they continue to reach those who are in crisis pregnancies in Champion Life. Lord, I pray that you would help us as a church reach out to those who are disadvantaged and broken in Champion Life. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be bold and be able to share when life begins, why life is so important, and that you are the one who is giving it to us. You are the one who is stamping us. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.